Well, hello everybody. I'm Scott Snibbe, and I'm here streaming live onto Tse Chen Ling's Facebook page. Sunday mornings we have what's called the Taste of Buddhism program, and every once in a while I'm a guest on that. I don't know if it's a actual program streaming through video. Normally it's an in-person program at Tse Chen Ling's San Francisco location. So ordinarily we have an introduction by one of the center members, but I'll introduce myself today. This program, Taste of Buddhism, is geared towards people who have no background in Buddhism whatsoever. It's open to anybody with any level of experience. And we typically try to take a secular approach to Buddhist topics, an approach where there's no type of beliefs or, culturally confusing or foreign terms that we use. We try to keep this open and accessible to everybody, and very open to your feedback too on how that works for you. My name's Scott. I'm Scott Snibbe, and I taught meditation at Tse Chen Ling in person for many years. Now I live across the bay, and I come over for a few events like this. I've been practicing Buddhism for about 20 years and leading meditation for about 13. And as you can see, I'm not a monk or a nun, so I'm not a kind of professional Buddhist that you sometimes see leading these. But I'm a person like you who's using some of these techniques to try to live a meaningful, happy life. We normally begin with some sort of a motivation at the beginning of teachings, just like you do at the beginning of a meditation session. So it's nice to do that very briefly now from your own perspective or from a structured way that we do it in this tradition. And typically what we do is we motivate and think that we're going to spend some time together, whether you stick with this for a few minutes or the full amount of time, in the service of bringing our mind towards its better nature, towards kindness and compassion, gentleness and wisdom, and letting the disturbing aspects of our mind gently fade away, that they're not seen as elements of our mind that are very strong and hard at the core of our being, but rather things that float on the surface of the mind and that can actually be gradually eliminated simply by reinforcing our better qualities. So that's the essence of meditation, is to reinforce our good qualities and apply some antidotes to let the ones that disturb us just gently fade away. And so the structure today is that, well, I'll give a little bit of a discussion on this topic, and I'll introduce the topic in a minute for about a half an hour. And then we'll have a very short break, go into a meditation on the topic for 15 or 20 minutes. And then at the end, there's time for questions and answers. So you can type those questions into the comment stream on the comment stream for the broadcast. And I'll see them and I'll be able to answer them. And feel free to type them in at any time too. We'll collect the questions as we go. So today the topic is cause and effect. From the Buddhist tradition, the term for this is karma, which is a very, I think, a kind of misunderstood and misinterpreted word. And so we'll focus more on this idea of cause and effect. I'll get into a little bit of the background of karma as it means traditionally, but mostly how cause and effect can be applied practically in a daily way with your mind. So to understand more the mental cause and effect than physical cause and effect, why things happen, in the universe and the world, but more how things happen in our mind and how we can gain control over them. So I hope that's useful. I know I haven't mastered my mind yet, and I use these techniques every day and find them quite helpful. So I want to start out actually with a reference to a movie. There's one of my favorite movies that came out about 10 years ago called The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick. And it's a movie that doesn't actually have very much dialogue or words. And there's a part of the movie where there's a mother whose son dies. And she's obviously has an incredible amount of grief. And you can see her grappling with this question of why her son died. And she's going to church and she's not finding solace there. And in the midst of her grief, all of a sudden there's this cut in the movie. And the movie cuts to the Big Bang. And then for about 20 minutes, the film goes through the whole evolution of the whole universe. You see nebulae coalescing and stars forming, the planets forming. Then you see Earth, about 4 billion years ago. And then all of a sudden it cuts to a dinosaur. You see this dinosaur who's about to kill another weaker dinosaur. And then it has second thoughts. It actually seems to show the first moment of compassion. Then there's the asteroid that hits Earth and destroys all life on Earth. So it goes on and on and on like this for about 20 minutes. And then the movie comes back to the present time. And it's a quite profound sequence because what it seems to say is that the answer to the mother's question of why her son died required rewinding and recapitulating all of history itself. And I find this very profound and a very beautiful view. I think Terrence Malick is Christian, and he was reflecting on this through a Christian point of view. But the idea is very related to the Buddhist notions of cause and effect and interdependence, seeing that everything in the universe is interconnected in an endless chain of cause and effect, that everything connects everything else back to the very dawn of time. And so I think if you can accept that, it's a quite profound view of the physical actions of the universe, for sure, to see that even as you're watching this program or making your breakfast, that those actions are connected back to the dawn of time and to everything else happening right now at this moment throughout the universe. So that's the kind of very broad way to begin this topic. It can be useful too at this time of the coronavirus to reflect on cause and effect too. In the world, you see that very small causes can have very large effects. Viruses are like that, and the Earth has managed to catch a lot of these viruses over the last 20 years so that they didn't explode. This particular virus started with bats and jumped to pigs, and then all of a sudden 3.5 billion people on Earth are grounded at home. And so thinking about that cause and effect can be useful to understand the sense of interdependence and how maybe your small actions also could potentially have very large effects in the world, and that it's worth looking at our behavior and steering it towards the greatest good, because something you do might have an impact as big as that virus. So we're going to talk mostly about cause and effect in our own minds today, as I mentioned, how we deal with day-to-day conflicts and psychological pain. If you're like me, at the end of the day, you have things that you regret. I have things that I resent sometimes. Sometimes things that keep me up feeling angry or fearful or guilty. And these things, they may seem only related to your own life and even to the things that just happened to you that day. But there's a practice in which you can take a similar journey backward with your own behavior and look at how your own mind is affected by many other things, besides, what other people did to you or what befell you in the world. Looking how your behavior is affected by the social environment around you, by our parents, by our education, by the media, and perhaps even this deeper view that our behavior is conditioned through millions of years of experience evolutionarily, the experiences of evolutionary psychology, and how the way that we had to respond to an environment 4 million years ago affects the way that we behave today. So after this discussion, I'll go through a meditation, a specific technique that helps us review the day and alter some of these habitual mental loops that can trouble us day to day, and that can seem hard to change. And Almost all the Buddhists in the Tibetan tradition that I'm familiar with, this tradition, that's the Dalai Lama's tradition, most of us do this practice every night. It's a simple meditation that you can do on the cushion or off the cushion, maybe even in bed, if you're tired. And it's a way to review the actions of the day, to reinforce the beneficial ones, and then to gently forgive yourself for the things that you regret, the things that were disturbing, to train your mind towards its better nature. And so by focusing on the mind, it brings to mind this idea of how the mind interfaces with matter. If humans have these incredible minds, and we become incredibly skilled, obviously, at observing and predicting and controlling all the material aspects of the universe, from things from spacecraft to microchips. Even this virus, you see the incredible precision that we've been able to predict its course, and also to predict how the measures that we're enacting to fight it will affect us. But the inner world of our mind is quite different than that. From a scientific perspective, we don't understand the mind as well as we do a virus or a spaceship or a microchip. And to a large extent, we don't know how to control it. So among the many scientific mysteries of the mind is this gap between thought and action. It's a very deep and profound question of how thoughts turn into actions, how thought turns into actions of speech and actions of your body. And this is the area where Buddhism has a lot to say of practical use and thousands of years of experience. This question of how thoughts become action. So here's an example. The simple act of having the thought to move your arm and then your arm moving is in one sense an act of telekinesis, this idea of mind controlling matter. If you remember, there was this guy, Uri Geller, in the 70s, who said he could bend spoons with his mind. He would just stare at it and bend the spoon. But in a way, just the movement of our hand or the movement of our head or a smile has the same kind of magic. Somehow a purely mental act has an impact on your body. And some of you may be, skeptical, scratching your heads and say, well, it starts in the brain and then it moves through, your neurons and cells and ATP and the movement of muscles. But there are gaps in that understanding that no one quite understands. Like, where was that first cause? How did the thought of the muscles to move occur in the first place? Where is it? Where did it come from? Is it made of matter? Is it made of energy? Is it made of information? In today's world, that's how we are starting to understand the universe more and more, is that information itself has a kind of reality to it. So all the physical achievements of conscious beings are preceded by mental events. And this isn't anything particularly magical. Venerable Rabina, who's coming to speak here soon, often talks about this, that before you do something physically, you have the idea to do it. So before a scientist received her PhD, she had the thought to do it. Before someone built a skyscraper, someone imagined it. And so mind precedes matter in conscious beings, not in a kind of magical, airy-fairy way, but in a very practical way. So without any hint of the spiritual or the supernatural, but purely from the scientific basis, we can say that mind's more powerful than matter. That it could even transform a planet, as we've shown with the Earth's environment. So even though there's a gap between the mental and the physical, and that there's a certain mystery there, still our mind must operate on some principle of cause and effect, since it's part of the same universe as everything else, and it has the same underlying laws. So in contemporary psychology, psychologists say that our future actions are determined by a combination of things, by our past actions, certain ingrained habits, by innate propensities, maybe the way we were born, certain tendencies, like some people are extroverts, some people are introverts, and by rational thought. And so 300 years ago, in the era of the Western Enlightenment, not the Buddhist Enlightenment, rational thought was seen as this differentiating factor of humanity. But more and more, we've seen that this kind of logical decision-making is rarer in people than we might hope. So, and if you look at your own mind, you may see this as well. It takes some conscious effort to sit and make rational decisions. People seem to be driven more by instinct and by strong emotions much of the time than by reason. And then unfortunately, those instinctual actions are driven most often by our primitive brain. So we have fears and desires that evolved in a more tribal and deadly and frightening world than we live in today. So, the boss yelling at you might seem as threatening as, a tiger attacking you a few hundred years ago. But in fact, you're not at the same risk and you don't need to respond in the same way. And so, to get away from these instinctual ways of behaving, from the psychological and the neuroscientific point of view, they're increasingly pointing away from notions of free will to notions of conditioning. So that most of our actions are automatic, that they're kind of loops. If anyone watched Westworld, the new version on HBO, it's so violent, but it has some very deep reflections on human nature and behavior, and the idea that humans may be quite similar to some forms of artificial intelligence in that you experience a certain initial stimulus and then all of a sudden it triggers a complete loop of behavior, which science backs up in many, many cases. So simple causes in your life, like hearing your morning alarm, smelling hot food, seeing the face of your child, or hearing the first words, perhaps a criticism that starts a familiar argument with your partner. I know I've certainly felt that way before. I sort of pulled along from a trigger that brought me into reenacting an entire scene that I've been through many times before in life. So there's actually a great series on BBC that Stephen turned me on to called The Strange Idea That We're Really Not in Control of Our Minds. And it's all about this subject, the most contemporary view of it today. And I highly recommend that. And we can link to it in the comments of this post later, actually, for anyone who wants to see it. But it'll give you a scientific perspective on free will. So increasingly, the psychological point of view says that most of our actions are unconsciously triggered and habitually repeated. And again, so from the scientific point of view, the psychological point of view, there's a new emphasis on practical therapies that instill new habits. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one that some of you may be familiar with, where you deliberately cultivate a new way of thinking, a new mental habit, and you practice it daily, and it counteracts a mental problem that you're having, like fear, or like anxiety, or strong craving. And this technique uses your higher brain to short circuit this evolutionary psychology, this deep fight or flee responses that we have to sometimes trivial experiences in our life, someone cutting in front of us at Starbucks. And these techniques break through those habitual responses so that we're able to reflect on our actions, so we can learn from others. They let us condition our behavior in any direction we like. This trainability of our minds is what distinguishes us from animals. Animals have to have new behavior encoded over hundreds or thousands of years through evolution, but we can alter the cause and effect of our minds, and thus our effect on the social world and on the natural world. So I wanted to mention that psychological and scientific point of view on mental cause and effect, because the Buddhist view of cause and effect is quite similar. This habit-forming idea of psychology is exactly what you do in meditation. So meditation practice seeks to harness that conscious awareness, becoming self-aware, using your rationality, and in the service of instilling new beneficial habits in our minds. So to bring your own mind's actions and reactions under conscious power, so that the habitual actions that we later take with speech and body become more positive and beneficial. So there's actually two different approaches here. So one is to recondition your automatic behavior so that you gradually diminish those automatic, like negative, angry responses, and you can condition positive ones. Condition yourself to be patient, kind. Often condition yourself just to do nothing is a good conditioning, just to be quiet when you start to have a difficult feeling. So that's one approach, is actually to recondition yourself towards positive, beneficial, kind, warm responses. To give people the benefit of the doubt is a great conditioning. Whenever someone does something, to think there's a reason they're doing that. They probably mean well. I might be misinterpreting them. So that's one approach, is to condition our automatic behaviors so that they become beneficial. Beneficial to ourselves most of all, because our mind then doesn't get as angry, as impatient, and so on. And then a second approach is to get out of habitual behavior completely. The term mindfulness is one that's very well known now, very popular. So this mindfulness approach to meditation seeks to make your behavior more and more conscious and present, rather than compulsive and automatic. And so more and more, what it does is it lets us escape our loops entirely, whether they're positive responsive loops or negative disturbing loops. There's also a way to completely get out of them, so that we're completely present, completely aware, and entirely in conscious control of our responses. So that's another approach. And then another type of meditation, through compassion, you seek to instill not just presence, not just awareness, but a rational, other-centered worldview where you see others as equally deserving happiness and wishing to be free from suffering, wanting to do our part to make the world more just and more kind. And that's like the third level of practice, is this outer focus practice. So going from training the automatic to becoming aware, mindful, and present, and then the last level of opening up and to having a warmth and a closeness and a sense of compassion all the time for others. So with sustained practice like this, it's even possible to realize that getting angry at someone for harming you is almost as logical as getting angry at gravity when you fall down. That you start to realize there's a larger chain of cause and effect behind our own actions that has little to do with the immediate face-to-face conflict in which we find ourselves. I'm sure you've had that experience of talking across people when you're in a conflict, neither of you really hearing each other. And that's because we have this endless chain of cause and effect behind us, causing us even to completely misinterpret the person in front of us, to see them as a threat rather than as our loved one. And so with this kind of view, where you start to see everyone's actions through cause and effect, a kind of forgiveness of both ourselves, forgiving ourselves, being gentle on ourselves, and also forgiving others, starts to come more naturally from this kind of practice meditation on cause and effect. Because we realize that our harmful actions don't generally stem from a strong will to harm, but rather from all kinds of causes and conditions that stem back to how we were raised, how our brains evolved even. So since we observe cause and effect operating all the time in the natural world. As I was saying, it's illogical to think that our internal world of the mind is any different, that there must be some kind of traceable connection of causes to effects, even in the mind. And this is where it seems reasonable to come back to the Buddhist term of karma. Traditionally, the way this word is used is understanding that the good things that happen to us and the bad things that happen to us and our disturbing thoughts and our urges, that these all come from seeds that were planted by long forgotten events, from a Buddhist view, not even in this life, but in lives before this one. So this view of karma is obviously very difficult for someone to accept who doesn't believe in past lives. And I've found in teaching meditation that it can even turn people off from these otherwise very beneficial practices, like the one that we're going to practice later today. So if we think of karma, though, more from the scientific perspective as conditioning, it aligns well with the way that science currently understands our minds. Because conditioning can encompass, the word conditioning can encompass the deep-seated evolutionary drives that drive our actions sometimes. And it can also encompass the things that we learned from our parents and from society. And so in this tradition, the word karma is often translated as volition. And volition is a slightly obscure word. An even more straightforward way to translate it is action. So that karma is action, and it's an action that results from prior conditioning. And so the Buddhism so wholly embraces this view of mental conditioning that another translation for volition, for karma, is conditioned reality. That this idea of karma, volition, is a manifestation in our minds, thought turning into action, that's wrapped up with our motivations and our desires, and quite often carries through to our verbal and our physical actions that affect the outer world. And there's a great new series of books that the Dalai Lama has written with Tibetan children. And in the third one, I can't remember its name right now, but the Dalai Lama, we can put that in the comments later too. But the Dalai Lama has made some very clarifying statements about karma, his view on karma, which are more aligned with the scientific view of cause and effect today. And he goes into quite some detail, but to oversimplify it, what the Dalai Lama said about karma is that he said that he believes that the events of the natural universe are controlled by the laws of physics, which is a reasonable thing to say, just the way science understands them. But he says that mental events, the way that people act and react and how we make decisions, are governed by internal psychological laws that relate more to our ethics and our motivations than to forces and particles. There are some hardcore materialists, scientific materialists, who believe that even our thoughts and actions are controlled, could be boiled down to some kind of analysis of particles and motion and so on. But right now there isn't evidence for that. We don't even understand actually how the world of particles and physics moves to chemistry, how that creates all the qualities of chemistry, or then that boundary between chemistry and biology, like how the individual substances interact to create life, and then the level beyond that of consciousness. So what the Dalai Lama says is that humans are fundamentally moral creatures, and that when we act against others' interest, or against our own, really, acting against others' interest is also acting against our own, that we create inner psychological pain that somehow has to be resolved. And I think this is the most important aspect, most practical aspect of cause and effect that you can deal with and grapple with yourself. And it can practically make your life a lot better if you have ways of processing cause and effect every day in your life. So when we go against others' well-being or against our own, we feel bad. And then when we don't address our daily conflicts and the little things that we regret, that we wish we didn't do, when we don't forgive ourselves, when we don't make some kind of minor resolution to do better in the world, there's a negative impact on your psyche that grows and deepens. And I say this not actually through scientific authority, but through my own experience. I think you've had the same experience. And if you don't do something with these thoughts and feelings, it affects your happiness, it affects your mood, and eventually it affects your personality. There's little things I did in grade school, that I still regret. Like, I wish so much I could go back and change just, something I said to a boy in my class once that made him cry. And so somehow you need, and of course things from yesterday, or things from this morning at home. And so somehow we need a way to process these things, like to get, to dig out of that psychological pain that comes from regretting the things that we did. So this is one of the observations of the Buddhist view of the mind, that without inner reflection and some daily form of forgiveness and self-soothing, I think is a nice word for this, that these little and large misdeeds of life come to control our behavior. And these are well understood psychologically, that we start to compulsively act out. We start to see ourselves as more separated and distant from others than connected with others. They're sowing the seeds of unhappiness in our own minds. And so one way of saying this is that we create the unhappiness that we perceive around us. When you're in a bad mood, things tend to look bad around you, and you also tend to create some negativity around you. And it's not that the world changes based on your inner state, but the way that we see the world changes based on our attitude and mood. And when I first learned about this in the Buddhist tradition, it resonated with me with an experience I used to have in the car. So some days in the car, this was like, especially in the old days with the radio, when you listen more to the radio, but it applies to your playlist too. Some days when I was driving, I would notice every song sounded bad. Every song on the radio, and then if I brought out my iPod, every song sounded bad. I couldn't find even one among thousands that I wanted to hear. And then the next day when I was in a better mood, I noticed that every song sounded good. And some of those were the same songs from the day before. And it sounds like a kind of trivial object to look at in this topic, but it's a nice, it's a simple way to look at the world as a mirror for your own inner life. That the songs haven't changed, it's your inner mood. That your attitude in facing the outer world changes how you perceive it. And so, more insidiously than that story about the songs, our mood can make us see people behaving kind and thoughtfully or neutrally to us, even our partner, as an enemy, through the same kind of negative conditioning. But luckily, it's possible to condition our minds in the other direction, towards love and kindness and trust and patience. So consciously or unconsciously, we know how our actions make us feel inside. And those feelings create our moods, our personality, either a sense of well-being and ease and concern for others, or one of fear and anxiety and selfishness. So addressing our own actions is the key to a positive, healthy sense of everyday well-being. And so that's where we come to this practice. So a first practical step in the direction towards such a healthy, positive way of living is a daily practice where you honestly evaluate your acts of the day. You rejoice and you reinforce the ones that you're proud of. It should be the majority of what you did during the day. It's hard to create problems all day long. And then also processing and forgiving yourself for the things that you regret. And so this is what I think is the most practical approach to cause and effect. It's actually part of how they teach it traditionally in Buddhism, but it's kind of like the fourth of 4 points. And how to evaluate and how to process your own beneficial and harmful actions each day. Another way is to say how to forgive yourself. So with the meditative approach, you don't dwell on the pathologies, the mental pathologies, the disturbances, but you focus on how you can productively process difficult experiences. I do want to pause for a second, though, and say that there are limits to this. And if you're someone who's experienced some severe trauma or abuse, or if you're dealing with very severe actions that are happening to you, that these techniques might not be the appropriate ones, and they might even be harmful, because there are some things you don't just want to process some sort of abuse and then go back for it the next day. And of course, if you're having those, then you should seek, other kind of psychological or even legal help. So these daily techniques for evaluating your mind stream are generally for the everyday frictions and conflicts, and a relatively healthy mind. And if you find yourself, in a more severe situation, then it might be useful to seek out other types of help. So when we look at this process, it's a process of building our self-control, and the self-control advances in levels, psychologically, and it has to do with our thoughts, our speech, and our body. So the first level is mastering the actions of your body, restraining your body. And most of us achieved this first level when we were kids. As a child, we mastered the ability to suppress urges to lash out with violence when we don't get what we want, or when we feel mental pain. I see that still in my daughter sometimes. She's 8, but she's almost completely mastered that level. And then the next level is verbal. And still, most of us as adults have some degree of mastery over this. You don't necessarily see it as much when we're watching politicians on TV today. But still, I think most everyday people have a mastery over their words, over their speech. But still, even on the best of days, I know I say a few thoughtless things that I regret, and I hurt others in some small or not so small ways, sometimes accidentally, but often through carelessness or self-centeredness. So that's the level of speech. And then the third level, the mind, is far more difficult. And the Buddhist tradition says that even the highly realized beings still have thoughts of anger and desire, but that they're able to let those thoughts pass right through their mind without grasping onto them, without acting on them, without judging themselves. So they're able to see the disturbing thoughts as separate from any solid identity of themselves, and let these unwanted emotions just float away without causing any harm to themselves or to anybody else. Tara Brach, who's become quite popular, she has a nice podcast now. There's an audiobook she has called Radical Self-Acceptance that is a really great training in this way of just accepting what goes through your mind without acting on it. And I highly recommend it. That we can put in the links too, if we remember to. So I think now it's good just to outline a little bit what the practice is and then go into the meditation. So for most of us, the practical level we're at is probably one, like I mentioned, of moderately uncontrolled speech. A few harmful actions of body we do when nobody's looking, So all of us, I think, or most of us, from time to time, we speak falsely, not quite true. We speak harshly. We speak divisively, speaking in a way that separates people from each other rather than brings them together. Also speaking meaninglessly or frivolously, when you really look at your mind, can also have a slightly negative effect. And so through the course of the day, you might try to defend what you did to others, rationalize them. But when you look closely at your mind, each of the actions leaves a little feeling of disappointment in yourself, in myself. And if this is unchecked, it grows. It can grow into, worse feelings like self-loathing. So what do we do with these feelings, with shame and guilt that we feel for having hurt someone else? Without doing something, the pain of hurting somebody else grows. It's really a challenge. I remember when Geshe Dakpa, who's a teacher at Tse Chen Ling, was teaching on this topic. He said that the first step in processing the day's deeds is what he called sincere regret. And so I asked him what was the difference between regret and guilt. Because I know that's how I feel a lot of the time at the end of the day, is just guilty for some of the things that I did. And he gave this really simple answer. He said that regret is honestly acknowledging that something you did was harmful and sincerely wishing not to do it again. But guilt is thinking that you're a bad person, that you're judging or even hating yourself for having done something wrong. And that has stuck with me ever since he said it. I always think about that when I start to feel bad about myself, and certainly when I do this practice in the evening. That of course, the embarrassment and the shame and guilt doesn't immediately clear away. But once that first wave of strong emotion dies down, in the quiet time at night, right before bed, I usually find it possible to make a clear-eyed catalog of the things that I regret from the day, like without pushing away the guilt and feeling bad about myself, and then rehearsing what I would have preferred to have said or done. And then again, worth reinforcing and mentioning again, is that before counting your demerits, which some of us are quite good at, it's useful to go through all the good things you've done during the day, and in fact to do much more of that. Rejoice in many, many things that you did good during the day. And then maybe just focus on one that you regret to do this practice with. So that's a nice way to start. Sometimes when you get home too, it's a nice day to rejoice of the good things in your day. So the first step of this is then to rejoice, to think about the things you regret. And then after that, you can think what I would have honestly rather done in that situation. What would I have said? What would I have preferred to have done? Imagining what you would have done, picturing yourself actually doing those things, rehearsing for the next time you're in a similar situation can be very helpful. So that's all very practical. You could even do all that on a walk if you remember to. And then the last part, there is a kind of a special form of analytic meditation where you find a way to forgive yourself. And that uses a form of visualization. It's often called it's called purification in this tradition, and there's usually a kind of visualization that accompanies it that we'll go through in a moment. That helps you feel almost that you've been purified through your body itself. Like, because we're embodied beings, these kind of embodied visualizations can really help us to feel something powerfully. And these visualization techniques have been studied by scientists, not only for mental cause and effect, but even for things like cancer. Even cancer patients do similar forms of visualization using a kind of bright light beaming towards the tumors. So if you can, settle yourself into a meditation posture. You can do this onto your floor, cross-legged, or you can sit in a chair. And in that case, you don't cross your legs, you just put your legs out and down and feet flat on the floor. And so we're going to go through this practice. It's a practice on mental cause and effect. The practice that you can do at the end of the day to review your day, rejoicing in the positive, and finding a sincere way to forgive yourself for anything that you regret. So it's a process of self-reflection at the end of the day, taking control of our mental cause and effect that's normally unconscious, of the habits and the activities that are conditioned by evolution. Realizing that we can take control of our minds and steer them toward virtue, so that our unconscious actions are beneficial, and also so that more and more we're self-aware and mindful to consciously choose how we react in the world. So adjust your posture a little bit in your seat. The most important element of posture is to straighten your spine. You could put your hands on your knees or your right hand atop the left with your thumbs touching. And tilt your head slightly down. Relax all the muscles in your shoulders, your neck, your face, your brow. Slightly tilt your head down and your gaze down a few feet in front of you. And if it's comfortable for you, half close your eyes so you have enough light to keep you awake, but you're going inward with your mind. Let me just think a little bit of our motivation to meditate. Our motivation is to bring our mind towards its natural best state, and to learn these techniques and practice these techniques for letting disturbing thoughts and emotions and feelings and bad habits go, so that we can live a happy, meaningful life and live a life that is joyful and purposeful, be of the greatest benefit to ourselves and to everyone around us. Wishing others good too, wishing that others are able to gain control of their minds, to be mindfully present, to choose responses to the world that bring us closer together, that foster kindness and warmth and generosity in the world. And so just for a minute, focus on your breath. Stabilizing is a very useful technique to do at the beginning of any meditation session, or sometimes a whole meditation session. So bring your mind to your breath, either at your nostrils or at your abdomen, rising and falling. And for 1 minute, try to keep your focus entirely on your breath. And if other thoughts or feelings or pains in your body or perceptions occur, just let them drift by in the way that we want to let other disturbing emotions drift by in our daily life. So practice now in this quiet way, with the breath as your object, and letting go of anything else that pops into your mind. So just for 1 minute. And so this is a practice you normally do at the end of the day. So you can imagine it's the end of the day, or even in bed. But it's fine to do in the morning too. You can think of the events from yesterday. And we start out with rejoicing. And think of everything good that you did. Good ways that you treated yourself. Many of us are alone right now, interacting much less with others. And so think of the good that you did for yourself, the healthy ways you spent your time yesterday. Times when you had mental peace and joy, happiness. And as you interacted with others on the phone or video or in your house, think of all the ways that you helped others and benefited others, the things that you feel satisfied and proud of. As simple as making breakfast for others, or smiling when someone looks at you, or giving someone a hug. These are some of the greatest things that we can do for other people every day. It doesn't have to be heroic. Those everyday actions are the ones we experience the most, so in some ways the most important. Maybe you helped someone learn. Maybe you listened to somebody who really wanted to share or who was feeling pain. Maybe someone felt better after talking to you. And simply by following the rules right now of staying home and wearing masks when we go out, we literally may have saved someone's lives. We might have saved 8 people's lives. I saw in one article that by moving from the way we used to live to this controlled shelter in place, that you could save 8 lives in 30 days compared to doing nothing at all. That's kind of incredible. Just by staying home, we're saving lives. And so just for a couple seconds, think for yourself, what is it that you rejoice in, that you're proud of doing in the last 24 hours? And then this next step of regret. What did I regret from my last 24 hours alive? And instead of a big pile of things, and hopefully there isn't a big pile of things, but instead of lots of things, just think of one. And that can be a stand-in, a proxy for everything else. There's one thing you wish you had done differently. Could have been a scowling face. It could have been something with your body. Or it could have been something with your speech, being impatient or critical. So without feeling guilty or bad about yourself, this clear-eyed way of thinking, I sincerely wish I hadn't done that. I'd prefer not to have. But gently understanding that it's very slow molding our behavior. Nobody's perfect. And just be gentle with yourself the way you would be with a child or your best friend or a close relative. I would have preferred not to have done that thing. And then we move into this visualization, this remedy of a visual way of forgiving yourself, understanding that your actions are part of the conscious and unconscious conditioning, the result of our human mind's reactive evolution, of imprints made by our parents, our school, the workplace, the media. Not all of these good. Many external influences that teach us that revenge is good, that self-righteous anger is helpful. Messages that aren't in your psychological best interest. And so to perform the self-forgiveness, Imagine that a bright sphere of light starts to form above the crown of your head. And that orb of light, it's the embodiment of forgiveness, of goodness and kindness and love. And there's an intelligence and awareness in that light that sees through you, that sees everything you've ever done, and has no judgment, and only kindness and compassion and love and forgiveness. This energy of purification. And imagine that light starts to drip down, like a liquid light nectar starts to ooze down, course down, like a little light waterfall beaming through the crown of your head. And that within your body there is a kind of darkness. You see that there's a kind of dark oiliness that you picture and visualize being pushed down by this light. And those are all the things that you regret, all the things you wish you hadn't done. And imagine this light pushing that darkness down. And as it does, you can feel your mind clearing, being forgiven, forgiving yourself. The light pushing down more and more. And soon light fills your entire body, and the darkness, the last bits of that dark, oily manifestation of the things you regret gets pushed out the bottom of your body until light courses freely through your body, and you can feel it. You feel lighter. You feel clearer. You feel forgiven. And now imagine what you would have rather done in that situation, what you would have rather said, if it was verbal, how you would have rather acted. And picture yourself actually doing this. And resolve to try and act like this the next time. And they say it helps to make a small resolution, not to react in the way that we regret for some reasonable amount of time. But the amount of time has to be completely reasonable. It might be a day, or an hour, or a minute, or even a second. And that's part of why this is nice to do before going to bed, because it's easy to resolve not to do whatever you regret until you wake up the next morning. So do that now. It's the morning, perhaps. If we feel in control of ourselves, you could resolve to be kind all day long. Today, Sunday, no matter what happens to you, to be kind. And coming out of that resolve, you would dedicate that all the goodness that comes out of this meditation, of the self-conditioning towards your better nature, that it goes towards steering your mind towards its better nature in two ways that we discussed. One, by steering yourself towards positive conditioned responses, forgiveness, kindness, giving each other the benefit of the doubt, seeing the benefit of keeping a calm mind in the face of conflict. So number one, dedicate towards positive conditioning, towards the person we want to be. And then second, dedicate toward becoming more self-aware, more mindful, so that as we go about our day, we're fully conscious to the workings of our mind, that we don't respond automatically, and instead we rationally, compassionately choose the best course of action, or no action at all, rather than being compelled by our inner loops and our mental habits, our urges, our conditioning. And then if it were nighttime, you could get into bed and relax and feel that you made peace with yourself, with a clear conscience, a sense of all the good you did in the world, the chain of cause and effect that leads you to do things that you regret, and a sincere wish to steer yourself more and more in the direction of kindness and compassion. And a nice side effect of this practice is that it also can help you sleep much better, get rid of the things that would have kept you awake, kept you anxious and stirring or worried or afraid. So we can come out of the meditation, and now it's time for question and answer. So I'll look and see some questions. I hope people made it back. I hope people made it back to the live stream. Okay, question 1. So one question here is, if karma or cause and effect mean that we have limited control of our lives, how can we exert change and transformation? So this is a great question, and as I mentioned, there's a huge debate about whether we have free will and how we have free will. But from this very practical perspective, the view on cause and effect is very encouraging, very optimistic, because it says that you simply need to become conscious and become aware. That if you're not even aware of the things that go through your mind and where your instinctual habits are, then you'll become a slave to them. So this sense of lack of control comes from from being dragged along by our mind, by feeling that we're not in control of our mind and our behavior. And so this meditation is very much to gain control. Just really all of meditation is meant to help you gain control of your mind. Some people say, freedom in the US is often freedom to do whatever you want. But freedom from this Buddhist perspective is actually the freedom not to be pulled along by your urges. So the view on cause and effect is very positive through these two ways, primarily through these two ways we mentioned. One, to systematically cultivate automatic habits of goodness so that you automatically respond with kindness, with forgiveness, with giving someone the benefit of the doubt. That's a great one to practice over and over again. Like, imagine somebody saying something rude to you and then giving them the benefit of the doubt, not taking it personally, realizing that there's cause and effect behind their behaviors. And then the second way, beyond reconditioning ourselves, is to become ever present, to be self-aware and present and mindful more and more, so that you're completely conscious as things are happening to you in the world. And you have that awareness right then to reflect and to think and to pause and consider how you'll react, rather than responding automatically, even avoiding responding automatically in a positive way, but becoming fully conscious and choosing how to react. So I think it's very optimistic from this perspective. Okay, another question. When the live stream got interrupted, you were talking about the benefits of visualization even with cancer patients. Yeah. So this was actually a friend of mine who was a cancer patient turned me on to this. This was actually before I even got into Buddhism. But he's someone who had less than a year to live. And this was 20 some years ago, and he's still alive. So he's certainly a good case study. But he told me about this, that at the time it was very experimental. Now there's many more studies on it. But that by using certain forms of visualization, both with pain and with very difficult to treat illnesses like cancer, that on the one hand, so talk about the cancer, he said actually that what you do is you visualize your tumors, and if you know where they are, you visualize where they are, and you actually visualize light moving into them, going into them, healing them, purifying them. And that, what he told me, and then I did look up some studies later, that people actually had, measurably better recoveries if they did this practice. Of course, you have to take on all the medical practices too. It's not like a miracle cure, but in conjunction with medical practices, it seemed to help. They also say this works for pain too, to actually send kind of light to where you're feeling pain, and that in many people's cases, that can help to also ease the pain. I think we all feel pain from time to time, so try it for yourself and see. And there are some scientific studies. I think I linked to some of them. I did a podcast on this topic recently. I think in the transcript there's some links to scientific studies. Another question. Someone says, I found your mention of practices of rejoicing very helpful. Could you talk more about the benefits of rejoicing? Yeah. So this was actually one of my early teachers said this was the kind of laziest and easiest way to meditate. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually a lot of lists and numbers and even like formulas for virtue. So they say that if you rejoice, and I'm not saying this is necessarily true or not, but it's kind of nice to think about. They say that by rejoicing in another person's good activities, that if you are superior to that person in your moral behavior, which I don't know how you'd know, that you get double the merit, that if you're equal to that person, you get the same merit, and that if they're superior to you, you get half the merit. So this teacher was saying like a really lazy way to practice would be to just come home from work at the end of the day, kick back on your couch, and just think of all the good things that the Dalai Lama did, and Doctors Without Borders today, all the nurses and doctors in emergency rooms, and to just think about all the good that they did. And I'm not so sure about this equation of virtue, but in terms of the psychological effect, it creates an outward focus of gratitude. The scientific benefits of rejoicing and feeling gratitude like this have been established. Benefits for yourself, that they do bring about a more stable, peaceful, happy mind, one that's more at ease with others, one that connects better with others, that's more compassionate. And so that's the benefit of rejoicing, and do it with people that you know, people that you don't know. Especially today, there's so much negative news on TV and on the computer. You kind of have to dig for good news sometimes. But you also have it in your own life. You can just think of all the good things that people did. And you can also just the ones that you assume they did. The Dalai Lama did his meditation practice today and gave lectures, spoke to people, wrote articles, sent emails, helped all the people around him. So if you know any particularly good people, for those of us who have spiritual teachers, it's really easy. They're alive. Like we can picture them living today. Our teacher, Geshe Dakpa, practicing, helping others, even materially helping others, sending money back to his monastery and supporting thousands of people who have dedicated their lives to spiritual practice. So it's a practice. You can sit there and it's like a fantasy, instead of ruminating on your day, feeling angry, feeling exhausted, you can be totally exhausted and do this practice. It's easy. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Oh, okay. So someone said, as a Buddhist, was karma hard for you to accept at first? I would say yes. The reason I got into Buddhism was kind of out of a little bit desperation. They say a lot of people get into Buddhism actually not when their life is bad, but when their life is good. That I was about 30 and I had a pretty good life, and yet I still noticed I had a lot of the things that I wanted to achieve in life. I achieved even earlier, like certain types of success and so on. But then I found I still had a lot of like anxiety, all kinds of disturbing emotions, jealousy, fear. And so I was looking for some solution, because it seemed like these things that the world said would make me happy, like living in a nice house and so on, weren't sufficient for happiness. And so, so I came to Buddhism kind of just by seeing how my teachers acted, like especially by seeing the Dalai Lama and what a nightmare life that he had really a nightmare life with 1 million Tibetan people dying, under his leadership and losing his entire country, and yet still being so positive and teaching so effectively and benefiting the world. When I saw him, I just wanted to be like him and like give me what he's having, like if you're at a bar or at a restaurant. And so I just wanted what the Dalai Lama is having. And I just committed that I would do these practices and as a kind of treatment, as a medicine, the way that the Buddha taught. And the Buddha said, try on the practices, set the ones aside if they don't make sense for you, but give them a chance, take them on as experimentally like a scientist. And so I did that and I saw huge benefits. And then gradually through, the way that teachers taught, started to understand more and more this karmic view. But, the deeper I went, there's great debate amongst extremely realized beings, both written down and, in contemporary discourse, as to how karma operates, what it really is. And even through like the highest, in the highest view of reality, karma actually ceases to function if your mind is in a highly realized state. So I actually think the Buddha himself actually refused to answer some questions like these like, where's karma stored and so on. So from my own, I'm not a scholar, but from my own research, I did not find definitive answers to some of these like questions like where's karma, what is it, how is it stored? But I found the actual practices of this purification and taking responsibility for my own actions and regretting them and not feeling guilty about them. This is where I found it really beneficial. And so I think a lot of those like questions about, even whether you have past and future lives isn't as relevant as doing the practice and seeing the benefit today. We just did it. So see the benefit it has today on your mind. And if it did, maybe try it again tomorrow. Okay. I see Lynn asked a good question. What's merit in Tibetan Buddhism? Sounds like a chart with gold stars. Yeah, I mean, this also goes to those like kind of unanswerable metaphysical questions. But this is the positive side of karma, is that the good that you do in the world, the things that genuinely benefit yourself and others, have a lasting effect on your mind. And I think if you talk to like a really committed Tibetan Buddhist who has that cultural worldview, they might say there is some like manifestation that merit gets stored somewhere or something like in a computer. But I think the psychological, scientific view is very easy to accept, which is just that it's conditioning. Everything you do or think reinforces a mental loop. They even say when you're remembering something, it's not actually a memory. It's almost like you're rewriting it every time. So that even memory is actually a habit, that everything in our mind is a habit or a loop, and it's our choice to reinforce it. And I think this secular way of looking at merit is simply that it's reinforcing the positive actions. But then of course you have to go back and decide what are positive actions, what are harmful actions. And again, the internal psychological view is a really easy one, because that you can't sneak away from, because you think that the things that, the good actions are the ones that make me feel good about myself and don't harm anybody else. And the harmful actions are ones that obviously harm others, but also ones that make me feel anxious, guilty and so on. And that's where it can be really helpful to study Buddhism, because this tradition is, 2,500 years of analyzing the mind and what are the causes of a happy, contented, stable mind. It's not an instant answer. It actually, takes some effort and introspection, mindfulness.